Hey guys, it's Cynthia and welcome back to my studio. After consistently posting on Sundays for a couple months, I finally hit a crunch period at my day job that just made recording weekly videos impossible for a little while, so I apologize for the break. I am not dead, just an art director. But I've really missed you guys, and it's great to be back. To celebrate getting out of the weeds, I'm gonna lean into something a little bit more lighthearted today. I had been kind of racking my brain to come up with an idea for a video that I could record this past week in the relatively short period of time between getting out of the crunch period and going out of town. So thankfully, all of that happened to coincide with the planning phase of a new Dungeons & Dragons campaign that I'm playing in for fun with some other game industry friends. So I realized this past week that I wanted to make a portrait for my character sheet, and I thought, why don't I just record the process? And, you know, I've been talking about doing more sketches from imagination, so this was kind of like killing three birds with one stone. So today's video and time-lapse chat is going to be about how I made a portrait of my new D&D character, TARG the Dwarf. And I assume most of you are familiar with the game Dungeons & Dragons since it's been around for a few decades at this point, but if you're not, it's a tabletop game where you and your friends get together and role play as characters that you create, while the dungeon master who runs the game takes the characters through an adventure or some kind of narrative arc and various combat encounters. And you and your adventuring party complete different kinds of quests and level up while you're trying to act out the parts of your characters. And, you know, you generally eat snacks and have a good time with each other. I played my first game of Dungeons & Dragons during 2nd edition in 1998 when I was in high school. And I got interested in it originally because of the art in the core rulebooks, particularly the monster manual. And I used to practice sketching in high school by copying Tony Dieterlitz's monster drawings and trying to make up my own monsters in a similar style. So that, and of course, the most fun part of the character creation process was always sketching out the portraits of the characters, and honestly, that hasn't changed much for me in the last 20 years. I still love making D&D character portraits, so here we are again. And when my group decided that they wanted me to be the tank in this campaign, I immediately knew I wanted to play a dwarf fighter. So in a fun coming full circle kind of twist, I actually painted the dwarf for the 5th edition player's handbook, and the piece that I'm working on for TARG is going to pretty closely echo the same steps that I took to make the one in the rulebook. There was a lot of amusing controversy on Twitter when that illustration was published about whether or not she should have a beard. And, you know, the jury's still out on that, but I do know that TARG has got decent charisma, so his beard should be excellent. So I always like to talk about what my goals are going into every image that I make. And with TARG, it was to capture the character's attitude above anything else. So TARG was formerly a famous soldier in his hometown who's used to having songs sung about him in the tavern, kinda. But after making some hot-headed bad decisions that got most of his company killed, he was banished. And now he kind of struggles with his newfound anonymity in the big city of Waterdeep. So he's got a good heart and he likes fighting with a group. He likes defending the weak, but he's also kind of, you know, into being the star. He's number one on Team TARG, so his narcissism and his boasting gets him into trouble. And so I wanted to capture that in his posture, with his strong stance and kind of an overall triangular body shape, kind of pushing his chest out and giving him a cocky facial expression. He's giving his best raised eyebrow DreamWorks face. And if you've been watching my other videos, my process for starting an image like this is a little different than the portrait studies. Besides the obvious change that I'm working digitally instead of with oil today, with portraits from observation, the first step is always sighting. That's looking at the model or subject that I'm working from and then trying to sketch out the shadow shapes and the boundaries of the form to create kind of a close to accurate representation of what I see in front of me in paint. And then I follow that up with color and value and detail. Whereas this time, I've substituted that first step with a sketch from my head without using reference. And instead of shooting for an accurate representation of life, I'm going to apply the same kinds of painting techniques over top of a caricature this time. So in terms of execution, at least, that's also the way that I typically approach concept art for characters. Starting with a sketch from imagination and then getting reference if and when I need it, and then painting the rest out from my head. Now, in this case, I'm not really reinventing what it means to be a dwarf here, but concept art and character portraits do serve similar needs. In this case, it's getting across the raw personality of my character for a casual game, so I care less about making everything hyper-realistic than communicating to my friends that their characters are probably going to want to slap this guy in the face a lot. If this was concept art, the challenge might also extend into creating unique morphology across a whole race of dwarves, or making costuming that represents a certain in-world faction. But we're not really doing any of that here. This is a pretty stock standard costume, and because of the timing, I actually rolled most of Targ's character sheet after making the sketch. So I made some costume adjustments along the way based on the rolls. Like, his starting gear is actually basic chainmail over a quilted fabric gambeson instead of plate armor. And again, I didn't, reinvent a custom look for chainmail to fit with unique world building. But since this is a digital piece, I can kind of treat it like a paper doll and change Targ's clothes later as he picks up new gear. And at the time, I also hadn't decided what Targ's weapon proficiencies were yet, so I'm just placeholdering in a super generic sword for now, but it could change later. Like if he ends up having a special blade that was passed down through generations of his family, or if it ends up being a particular sword that he picks up after an encounter or something, that might be cool to go back in and sort of add specific character detail into his costuming later. I want to briefly talk about imaginative drawing, since we discovered in my sketchbook tour video that I don't really do a lot of it, unless it's during a really early planning step for a finished piece. Whereas someone like my friend Richard Witters, who's an art director and concept artist for Dungeons & Dragons, works almost exclusively from imagination. So if you're not following Richard on Instagram, I'll give him a plug and link it down in the description box for you. Richard does incredible work that's so full of life and personality, and almost entirely from his mind. It's very different than what I do. And that kind of work is a real struggle for someone like me who's more heavily reliant on observation. And we often talk about collaborating or wanting to find the bridge between both of our skill sets. It's really rare to find someone, for example, who's both a classically trained academic realist and a skilled cartoonist. And that's because both pushing a gesture beyond what you can see or getting your imaginative work closer to reality are both serious efforts that require a ton of practice. But with the right kind of focused practice, it is a gap that you can start to close, whichever side of that gap you're on. And something like this character sketch of Targ is an attempt to build a bridge by starting from imagination and then bringing in reference later in the process and kind of leaving more of the original caricature intact, which will hopefully sell his personality better than making an accurate portrait of someone from real life could. Targ is well on his way at this point, and so as you're watching some of the costume details finish up, I'm going to switch gears for the end of the video, because a while back, some of you suggested that I try to wrap some Q&A questions into these chat videos, and I think that's a great idea. So while the time lapse is going, I've picked out a couple of your questions to finish off today's video. Zek Zakun asks, are there any places on the web where you go to find references? So specifically for studies, when I don't shoot my own reference, I do sometimes scrub through Google for reference images. And obviously these are just for practice and not intended for sale or commercial use of any kind, because you don't want to infringe on a photographer's or a model's copyright. You want to, keep your work original. But when I do use Google, I do tend to search things like natural light portrait and filter the search results by high res. And sometimes I also use DeviantArt for stock, like one of my last videos was off of Deviant stock, and you just have to, follow whatever the community rules are in that case. And just like Google, it's hit or miss in terms of the image quality. So what I look for in an image is mainly the quality of the light. I look for good shadow shapes or a good balance between warm and cool colors. And I don't like studying from photos that have been heavily edited because they tend to kind of ruin that light quality or that color. And the other place that I like to get practice reference is video stills from movies and TV. Like you can often really find like dramatic lighting that's hard to set up in a studio situation, but like easy for, a cinematographer for a feature film. And you also get, well-composed frames sometimes and a wider range of facial expressions than you would if you're searching for like fashion models. I was just watching the Winter Olympics earlier today, and there was a guy that was doing an interview. He had done like the design for the big ski slope. And I thought, man, that guy has got a cool face. I want to paint that guy's face, And so sometimes you just have a reaction to something you see on screen and need to pause and take a screenshot for practice later. Sabolch Nagi asks, would you consider mentoring people, or do you have any classes online available? So for now, making these videos is kind of the closest thing to online classes that I can reasonably manage with my schedule. I work 40 to 50 hours a week as a full-time art director. And even if I had more free time, I'm not actually sure I would do things much differently, because I'm not really interested in being a full-time teacher, at least not right now. Maybe in 5 or 10 years that'll change, but teaching is a skill that I would want to grow into more before trying to take on a class or a mentorship or something like that. It takes a lot of, class planning and behind the scenes work in itself. And for now, I'm kind of happier to share what I'm feeling on YouTube and, occasionally go out and do class lectures and things like that are a little bit more piecemeal. So thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you enjoyed this ridiculous interlude as I'm getting back on my feet making videos. I apologize again for the break. I really will try not to do that as much in the future, but life happens, so you can't really control it. But for now, I'm gonna go grab a cup of coffee and try to edit this video in time to catch the Olympic figure skating tonight, which I love, and start planning for the next video. So hopefully I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.